Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. We are still in Pyrrhus. At last, after Demetrius had been overthrown in Syria, Lysimachus, who had secured his affairs and had nothing to do, immediately turned his whole forces upon Pyrrhus, who was in quarters at Edessa, and falling upon and seizing his convoy of provisions, brought first a great scarcity into the army. Then, partly by letters, partly by spreading rumors abroad, he corrupted the principal officers of the Macedonians, reproaching them that they had made one their master who was both a stranger and descended from those who had ever been servants to the Macedonians, and that they had thrust the old friends and familiars of Alexander out of the country. The Macedonian soldiers, being much prevailed upon, Pyrrhus withdrew himself with his epirots and auxiliary forces, relinquishing Macedon. Just after the same manner he took it. So little reason have kings to condemn popular governments for changing sides as suits their interests, as in this they do but imitate them who are the great instructors of unfaithfulness and treachery, holding him the wisest that makes the least account of being an honest man. Now, one of the things we obviously running into is the fact that it does not matter what ancestry or popularity or amount of wealth is the position of the body of the person who is to be given political or religious authority, or to be considered as such. I mean, ideally that's how it should be, but Pyrrhus, having thus retired into Epirus and left Macedon fortunate, gave him a fair occasion of enjoying himself in quiet and peaceably governing his own subjects. But he who thought it a nauseous course of life, not to be doing mischief to others, or receiving some from them, like Achilles, could not endure repose, but sad and languished far, desiring battle and the shout of war, and gratified his inclination by the following pretext for new troubles. The Romans were at war with the Tarentines, who, not being able to go on with the war, nor yet through the foolhardiness and the viciousness of their popular speakers to come to terms and give it up, proposed now to make Pyrrhus their general, and engage him in it, as of all the neighboring kings, the most at leisure and the most skilful as a commander. The more grave and discreet citizens, opposing these counsels, were partly overborne by the noise and violence of the multitude, and while others, seeing this, absented themselves from the assemblies, only one Meton, a very sober man, on the day this public decree was to be ratified, when the people were now seating themselves, came dancing into the assembly like one quite drunk, with a withered garland and a small lamp in his hand, and a woman playing on a flute before him. And as in great multitudes met at such popular assemblies, no decorum can well be observed. Some clapped him, others laughed. None forbade him, but called to the woman to play, and to him to sing to the company, when they thought he was going to do so. 'Tis right of you, O men of Tarentum, he said, not to hinder any from making themselves merry that have a mind to it, while it is yet in their power. And if you are wise, you will take out your pleasure of your freedom while you can. For you must change your course of life and follow other diet when Pyrrhus comes to town. These words made a great impression upon many of the Tarentines, and a confused murmur went about that he had spoken much to the purpose, but some who feared they should be sacrificed if a peace were made with the Romans reviled the whole assembly for so tamely suffering themselves to be abused by a drunken sot, and crowding together upon Maton, thrust him out. So the public order was passed, and ambassadors sent into Epirus, not only in their own names, but in those of all the Italian Greeks, carrying presents to Pyrrhus, and letting him know they wanted a general of reputation and experience, and that they could furnish him with large forces of Lucanians, Messapians, Samnites, and Tarentines, amounting to 20,000 horse and 350,000 foot. This did not only quicken Pyrrhus, but raised an eager desire for the expedition in the Epirots. There was one Cineas, a Thessalian, considered to be a man of very good sense, a disciple of the great orator Demosthenes, who, of all that were famous at that time for speaking well, most seemed, as in a picture, to revive in the minds of the audience the memory of his force and vigor of eloquence, and being always about Pyrrhus, and sent about in his service to several cities, verified the saying of Euripides that the force of winds can do whatever is done by conquering swords. And Pyrrhus used to say that Cineas had taken more towns with his words than he with his arms, and always did him the honor to employ him in his most important occasions. This person, seeing Pyrrhus eagerly preparing for Italy, led him one day, when he was at leisure, into the following reasonings. The Romans, sir, are reported to be great warriors and conquerors of many warlike nations. If God permits us to overcome them, how should we use our victory, you asked? Said Pyrrhus, a thing evident of itself. The Romans once conquered, there is neither Greek nor barbarian city that will resist us, but we shall presently be masters of all Italy, the extent and resources and strength of which any one should rather profess to be ignorant of than yourself. Cineas, after a little pause, and having subdued Italy, what shall we do next? Pyrrhus, not yet discovering his intention. Sicily, he replied, next holds out her arms to receive us, a wealthy and populous island, and easy to be gained, for since Agathocles left it, only faction and anarchy, and the licentious violence of the demagogues prevail. You speak, said Cineas, what is perfectly probable, but will the possession of Sicily put an end to the war? God grant us, said Pyrrhus, victory and success in that, and we will use these as forerunners of greater things, which could forbear from Libya and Carthage, and then within reach, which Agathocles even when forced to fly from Syracuse after passing the sea only with a few ships, had all but surpassed. Now, just because they're asking divine favor doesn't mean that, it's in the way of God. But a misconception that a lot of people have for some weird reason, even though Islam doesn't allow wars of conversion, doesn't allow forced conversion of captives or anything like that. The Quran makes clear that. You have numerous narrations from the Shia and the Sunni that forbid wars of extending borders, or wars to capture slaves, or wars to, by wars, battles, fight, whatever. And you find that nations with the highest percentage of people who claim to be Muslim, who are listed as Muslim, as countries where there weren't the battles fought. It was just people saying, "Oh, this is the principle I live by," and and more thoroughly too. Look at what happened with the Tibetan Buddhism. Look at certain other forms of Buddhism. Some forms of Hinduism, Hinduism is the wrong term, but a bunch of religions under the auspice of that British designation, and Christianity, particularly Catholicism, and of course Orthodox. The purity, the path per se, it, mixes with the other, and you lose track of which is which. And, when you're trying to force, and then, their way kind of makes its way on you a little stronger. So yeah, change the minds, not the, these conquests, once perfected, will any assert that of the enemies who now pretended to despise us. Any one will dare to make further resistance. None, replied Cineas, for then it is manifest we may with such mighty forces regain Macedon, and make an absolute conquest of Greece. And when all these are in our power, what shall we do then? Said Pyrrhus, smiling. We will live at our ease, my dear friend, and drink all day, and divert ourselves with pleasant conversation. When Cineas had led Pyrrhus with his argument to this point, and what hinders us now, sir, if we have a mind to be merry and entertain one another, since we have at hand without trouble all those necessary things to which, through much blood and great labor and infinite hazards and mischief done to ourselves and to others, we design at last to arrive. Such reasonings rather troubled Pyrrhus with the thought of the happiness he was quitting, than any way altered his purpose, having been unable to abandon the hopes of what he so much desired. And first he sent away Cineas to the Tarentines with 3,000 men. Presently after, many vessels for transport of horse and galleys, and flat-bottomed boats of all sorts arriving from Tarentum, he shipped upon them 20 elephants, 3,000 horse, 20,000 foot, 2,000 archers, and 500 slingers. All being thus in readiness, he set sail, and being halfway over, was driven by the wind, blowing, contrary to the season of the year, violently from the north, and carried from his course, but by the great skill and resolution of his pilots and seamen, he made the land with infinite labor, and beyond expectation. The rest of the fleet could not get up, and some of the dispersed ships, losing the coast of Italy, were driven into the Libyan and Sicilian Sea. Others, not able to double the Cape of Japagium, were overthrown by the night, and with a boisterous and heavy sea throwing them upon a dangerous and rocky shore, they were all very much disabled, except the royal galley. She, while the sea bore upon her sides, resisted with her bulk and strength, and avowed the force of it, till the wind coming about blew directly in their teeth from the shore, and the vessel keeping up with her head against it was in danger of going to pieces. Yet, on the other hand, to suffer themselves to be driven off to sea again, which was thus raging and tempestuous, with the wind shifting about every way, seemed to them the most dreadful of all the present evils. Pyrrhus, rising up, threw himself overboard. His friends and guards strove eagerly who should be most ready to help him, but the night and the sea, with its noise and violent surge, made it extremely difficult to do this, so that hardly, when the wind began to subside, he got ashore, breathless and weakened in body, but with high courage and strength of mind, resisting his hard fortune. The Messapians, upon whose shore they were thrown by the tempest, came up eagerly to help them in the best manner they could, and some of the straggling vessels that had escaped the storm arrived, in which were a very few horse, and not quite 2,000 foot, and 2 elephants. With this Pyrrhus marched straight to Tarentum, where Cineas, being informed of his arrival, led out the troops to meet him. Entering the town, he did nothing unpleasing to the Tarentines, nor put any force upon them, till the ships were all in harbour, and the greatest part of the army got together. But then, perceiving that the people, unless some strong compulsion was used to them, were not capable either of saving others or being saved themselves, or were rather intending, while he engaged for them in the field, to remain at home bathing and feasting themselves, he first shut up the places of public exercise, and the walks where in their idle way they fought their country's battles and conducted their campaigns in their talk. He prohibited likewise all festivals, revels, and drinking parties as unseasonable, and, summoning them to arms, showed himself rigorous and inflexible in carrying out the conscription for service in the war, so that many, not understanding what it was to be commanded, left the town, calling it mere slavery, not to do as they pleased. He now received intelligence that Lavinus, the Roman consul, was upon his march with a great army, and plundering Lucania as he went. The Confederate forces were not come up to him, yet he thought it impossible to suffer so near an approach of an enemy. He drew out with his army, but first sent a herald to the Romans to know if before the war they would decide the differences between them and the Italian Greeks by his arbitrament and mediation. But Lavinus, returning answer that the Romans neither accepted him as an arbitrator nor feared him as an enemy, Pyrrhus advanced and encamped in the plain between the cities of Pandacia and Heraclea, and having notice the Romans were near and lay on the other side of the river Ceres, he rode up to take a view of them, and seeing their order, the appointment of the watches, their method, and the general form of their encampment, he was amazed, and addressing one of his friends next to him, "This order," said he, "Megacles of the barbarians, is not at all barbarian in character. We shall see presently what they can do." And growing a little more thoughtful of the event, resolved to expect the arriving of the Confederate troops, and to hinder the Romans if in the meantime they should endeavor to pass the river. He planted men all along the bank to expose them, but they, hastening to anticipate the coming up of the same forces which he had determined to wait for, attempted the passage with their infantry, where it was fordable, and with the horse in several places, so that the Greeks, fearing to be surrounded, were obliged to retreat. And Pyrrhus, perceiving this, and being much surprised, bade his foot officers to draw their men up in line of battle and continue in arms, while he himself with 3,000 horse advanced, hoping to attack the Romans as they were coming over, scattered and disordered. But when he saw a vast number of shields appearing above the water, and the horse following them in good order, gathering his men in a closer body, himself at the head of them, he began the charge, conspicuous by his riches and beautiful armor, and letting it be seen that his reputation had not outgone what he was able effectually to perform, while exposing his hands and body in the fight, and bravely repelling all that engaged him, he still guided the battle with a steady and undisturbed reason, and such presence of mind as if he had been out of the action, and watching it from a distance, passing still from point to point, and assisting those whom he thought most pressed by the enemy. Here Leonatus the Macedonian, observing one of the Italians very intent upon Pyrrhus, riding up towards him, and changing places as he did, and moving as he moved, "Do you see, sir," said he, "that the barbarian on the black horse with white feet, he seems to be one that designs some great and dangerous thing, for he looks constantly at you, and fixes his whole attention, full of vehement purpose, on you alone, taking no notice of others. Be on your guard, sir, against him." "Leonatus," said Pyrrhus, "it is impossible for any man to avoid his fate, but neither he nor any other Italian shall have much satisfaction in engaging with me." While they were in this discourse, the Italian, lowering his spear and quickening his horse, rode furiously at Pyrrhus, and ran his horse through with his lance, and at the same instant Leonatus ran his through. Both horses falling, Pyrrhus's friends surrounded him and brought him off safe, and killed the Italian, bravely defending himself. He was by birth a Frontinian, captain of a troop, and named Aplecus. This made Pyrrhus use greater caution, and now seeing his horse give ground, he brought up the infantry against the enemy, and changing his scarf and his arms with Megacles, one of his friends, and obscuring himself, as it were, in his charged upon the Romans, who received and engaged him, and a great while the success of the battle remained undetermined, and it is said that there were 7 turns of fortune, both of pursuing and being pursued, and the change of his arms was very opportune for the safety of his person, but had like to have overthrown his cause and lost him the victory. For several falling upon Megacles, the first that gave him his mortal wound was one Dixaus, who, snatching away his helmet and his robe, rode at once to Lavinus, holding them up and saying aloud he had killed Pyrrhus. These spoils being carried about and shown among the ranks, the Romans were transported with joy and shouted aloud, while equal discouragement and terror prevailed among the Greeks, until Pyrrhus, understanding what had happened, rode about the army with his face bare, stretching out his hand to his soldiers. Well, probably not that way. And telling them aloud, it was he. At last, the elephants more particularly began to distress the Romans, whose horses, before they came near, nor enduring them, went back with their riders, and upon this he commanded the Thessalian cavalry to charge them in their disorder, and routed them with great loss. Dionysius affirms near 15,000 of the Romans fell. Hieronymus no more than 7,000. On Pyrrhus' side, the same Dionysius makes 13,000 slain, the other under 4,000. But they were the flower of his men, and amongst them his particular friends, as well as officers, whom he most trusted and made use of. However, he possessed himself of the Romans' camp, which they deserted, and gained over several confederate cities, and wasted the country round about, and advanced so far that he was within about 37 miles of Rome itself. After the fight, many of the Lucanians and Samnites came and joined him. I'm trying to give it a Greek way of pronunciation right. Whom he chid for their delay, but yet he was evidently well pleased and raised in his thoughts that he had defeated so great an army of the Romans with the assistance of the Tarentines alone. Now, of course, there's not Greek characters in here, so, now I know some of it, that there's no V in Greek, but, so obviously those are Latin. But the Romans did not remove Lavinus from the consulship, though it is told that Caius Fabricius said that the Epirots had not beaten the Romans, but only Pyrrhus. Lavinus insinuating that their loss was not through want of valor, but of conduct, but filled up their legions and enlisted fresh men with all speed, talking high and boldly of war, which struck Pyrrhus with amazement. He thought it advisable by sending first to make an experiment whether they had any inclination to treat, thinking that to take the city and make an absolute conquest was no work for such an army as his was at the time, but to settle a friendship and bring them to terms would be highly honorable after his victory. Cineas was dispatched away and applied himself to several of the great ones, with presents for themselves and their ladies from the king, but not a person would receive any, and answered as well men as women, that if an agreement were publicly concluded, they also should be ready, for their parts, to express their regard to the king. And Cineas, discoursing with the Senate in the most persuasive and obliging manner in the world, yet was not heard with kindness or inclination, although Pyrrhus offered also to return all the prisoners he had taken in the fight without ransom, and promised his assistance for the entire conquest of all Italy, asking only their friendship for himself and security for the Tarentines, and nothing further. Nevertheless, most were well inclined to a peace, having already received one great defeat, and fearing another from an additional force of the native Italians, now joining with Pyrrhus. At this point, Appius Claudius, a man of great distinction, but who, because of his great age and loss of sight, had declined the fatigue of public business after these propositions had been made by the king, hearing the report that the Senate was ready to vote the conditions of peace, could not forbear but commanding his servants to take him up, was carried in his chair through the forum to the Senate house. When he was set down at the door, his sons and sons-in-law took him up in their arms, and walking close round about him, brought him into the Senate. Out of reverence for so worthy a man, the whole assembly was respectfully silent. And a little after raising up himself, I bore, said he, until this time, the misfortune of my eyes with some impatience. But now, when I hear of these dishonorable emotions and resolves of yours, destructive to the glory of Rome, it is my affliction that being already blind, I am not deaf too. Where is now that discourse of yours that became famous in all the world, that if he, the great Alexander, had come into Italy and dared to attack us when we were young men, and our fathers who were then in their prime, he had not now been celebrated as invincible, but either flying hence are, falling here, had left Rome more glorious, you demonstrate. Now, that all that was but foolish arrogance and vanity, by fearing Molossians and Chaonians, ever the Macedonians pray, and by trembling at Pyrrhus, who was himself but an humble servant to one of Alexander's lifeguard, and comes here not so much to assist the Greeks that inhabit among us, as to escape from his enemies at home, a wanderer about Italy, and yet dares to promise you the conquest of it all, by that army which has not been able to preserve for him a little part of Macedon. Do not persuade yourselves that making him your friend is the way to send him back. It is the way rather to bring over other invaders from thence, contemning you as easy to be reduced. If Pyrrhus goes off without punishment for his outrages on you, but, on the contrary, with the reward of having enabled the Tarentines and the Samnites to laugh at the Romans, when Appius had done, eagerness for the war seized on every man, and Cnaeus was dismissed with this answer, that when Pyrrhus had withdrawn his forces out of Italy, then, if he pleased, they would treat him about friendship and alliance, but while he stayed there in arms, they were resolved to prosecute the war against him with all their forces, though he should have defeated 1,000 Venuses. It is said that Cnaeus, while he was managing this affair, made it his business carefully to inspect the manners of the Romans, and to understand their methods of government, and, having conversed with their noblest citizens, he afterwards told Pyrrhus, among other things, that the Senate seemed to him an assembly of kings, and as for the people, he feared lest it might prove that they were fighting with a Lernaean hydra, for the consul had already raised twice as large an army as the former, and there were many times over the same number of Romans able to bear arms.